Welcome to The Non-Writer. I'm Rees, and today I'm talking with Howard Rodman, who was part of the New York no-wave scene in the late 70s. And he's going to tell us about that and how he ends up playing at Giorgio Gomelsky's Zoo Manifestival in October of 1978. Hi, Howard. How are you doing?
Fine. How are you?
I'm
very happy to be talking to you, and thank you for having me on your show.
Sure, thanks. And before we get into the 70s New York stuff that you were doing, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and maybe how that stuff in the 70s led up to what you're doing now?
So in the 70s, which is in my 20s, I was writing novels that I couldn't publish. I wrote one that got me a very good agent. I wrote a second that lost me that agent. I wrote a third that got me a bad agent. I wrote a fourth that lost me even that. I was 31 years old and had 4 novels in the drawer that nobody wanted to read and had subsisted on a variety of odd and unsuitable jobs in order to make that possible. I was sort of, I was in a cul-de-sac, if you want to put it cheerfully. And then my then girlfriend, who became my wife, moved out to Los Angeles, and I'd always loved film, and so I transitioned from writing unpublishable novels to writing unproducible screenplays. It seemed like the appropriate slide at that point in my life.
And when did that happen?
That was in the early 80s. I moved to Los Angeles in 1985.
Okay. And you're there now, right?
And I'm there now. I'm still there, still here. At any rate, I think I just didn't have the heart to write another novel that wasn't going to get published after going 0 for 4. But I did learn how to write. And while I was doing all of that writing, I did a variety of, fun things, taxing things, interesting things. I edited a bunch of small folding magazines with titles like the Bill of Rights Journal. My friends were fellow writers. We helped organize the National Writers Union, which was a union of freelancers. I was a paid staff organizer for the Committee of Interns and Residents, organizing doctors fighting for the 80 hours we eventually got, down from 120. And I think one of the things that happened in that era, because New York was near bankruptcy, I think we all remember that famous Daily News headline, Ford to City, drop dead. And what is now called Tribeca had not yet become a kind of, in Michael Sorkin's phrase, a ghost town disguised as a theme park. If you were a writer, if you were an artist, if you were a photographer, if you were a poet, you probably knew a lot of other people who were doing the same, and you were probably in a band. I mean, it just sort of followed. And I was one of those creatures whose life was saved by rock and roll. I mean, I was kind of lost and wandering, and then, starting in like around 1975, started going to CBGBs to see television, and then television with Patti Smith opening for television, and then Patti Smith with television opening for Patti Smith, and then Talking Heads, and then Blondie, and then the Ramones, and then God knows what else.
So did you play an instrument at that time?
No, I mean, at that time, I had, like many other people, played college dormitory acoustic folk guitar. You know, if you want me to sit down, if you hand me a Martin and ask me to do "Blowing in the Wind," I can do that.
Well, that's something.
Yeah, but no, I didn't have an instrument at the time. But many people I knew were just forming bands based on sensibility and passion and having nothing to do with technical expertise. You know, if you didn't know how to play your instrument, you had that much less to unlearn. So a couple of friends were joining a band and they needed a guitarist, and I sort of, I played guitar once. It's like, okay, I went and got a guitar. I went to 48th Street, where one got musical instruments in those days. You know, there was Sam Ash and Manny's and all of those stores, all in sort of one block of New York City. And saw a guitar that really struck my fancy, and the guy behind the counter told me that it had just been given to them, sold to them by Tom Verlaine, who sold them that guitar and his Ampeg amp. It was a Dan Armstrong Ampeg, the sort of heavy plexiglass guitar. I sort of understand why he gave it up. Very hard to keep in tune, not very good intonation. The bridge was sort of made of wood with little carvings in it. It was, it had drawbacks, but it had soul. And so I got it. I bought myself a Fender Twin Reverb, which seemed to be the right amp for that era. And then I was in a band. I mean, it just, but it sounds sort of like it was a series of discrete, coherent steps with a purpose, but it actually was just what everybody was doing. It's like, oh yeah, we're in a band. Oh, we're in this other band. Oh, where are you playing? We're playing Friday night. You want to open for us? Can we open for you?
So how long between you and your friends picking up your instruments and then playing a live gig?
Very, very short period of time. It wasn't like we felt we needed to hone our craft.
But you wrote some songs, I assume.
I tried. I mean, what's weird is I'm a good writer. I'm not a great songwriter. It seems to be a distinct and disparate skill. I wrote a couple of songs that were kind of, based on hooks or slogans, but they didn't have much more than that. There was one called Wages for Sleep, which was something I was, very into. I thought we should get paid, not just for the 8 hours we work for the man, or, we should get paid for the 8 hours that we dream.
And how would you describe the music of this band?
Basic. Not in the current sense of basic bitch, but in the old school sense. But, I was writing songs. I'm trying to remember, you say you can't put a price on having a good time, but it's 7 a.m. and I've got to get to work at 9. Wages of sin, it's at the movie show. Wages of fear, it's at the movie show. Wages of sin, something, something, something. But all I want is wages for sleep. Do, 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 do.
The no wave bands were known for their harshness, their dissonance, their screaming. Were you a band like that, or how were you different from the other
Yes
boys?
and no. I mean, the first band I was in was called Made in USA, named after the most obscure Jean-Luc Godard movie we could find. It was the one that was unreleasable because it was loosely based on a Richard Stark novel, of which Godard had adapted, but the rights to which he had neglected to obtain. We screamed, certainly. The lead singer, David Levine, otherwise known as David Jonzinski, after an obscure Soviet-era anarchist figure. He screamed, he played the sax. I played I guess you could call it a sort of skronk guitar if you wanted to. I don't know.
And apparently you went by the name Howard Romance.
For a brief period, I did. And, all I can say is I was young, And then there was, so I was on guitar, David was on sax, and he was the band leader. There was a bass player named Allie who had come in from Australia with like $5 in her pocket and didn't know anything except that there was interesting stuff happening in New York and she needed to be there. And so she was our bass player. Our keyboard player was a guy named Hillel Dolginus, or Hilly. who was probably the most accomplished musician in the group, maybe the only accomplished musician in the group. And he was great. Except he couldn't play gigs on Friday night because he was religiously observant. The sort of cut to the clip of John Goodman from Lebowski saying, "I don't roll on Shabbos," it was that kind of thing. And then our drummer, our main drummer, we had a couple, was a guy named Hassan, otherwise known as Jerry Heiserman, who was a kind of original beat figure. He was the roommate of Herbert Huncke, who was a fellow junkie with William Burroughs. He was friends with Ginsberg. He later spent a lot of time at the Naropa Institute for Disembodied Poetics in, out in the West. And he was sort of a touchstone for us, and we loved him. And he was a good drummer, but he was not the most reliable of drummers, if I can say.
Okay.
Hassan of blessed memory. And there's a wonderful obit that appeared when he died that I can send to you. And then occasionally we'd have as our drummer another poet named Greg Masters, who was a really, really good poet and a good drummer too. But so I think we were not trying for impossible dissonance, but I think our lack of chops bent us in that direction. And we were, I think, trying to be a bit political and polemical, and I think we succeeded in that. We were loud, we were noisy, we were brash. We wanted to smash the state, we wanted to smash upward mobility, in ourselves and others. And so that's what we were. And we played a bunch of gigs. We played CBGB's, we played Irving Plaza, we played
Max's.
We never played Max's, but places like that. The CB's gig was very memorable for me because how to put this? David liked to sing. David didn't want me to sing, but I wanted to sing. And so I finally convinced him that I should get one song in the set. And so after some complex and protracted negotiations, he allowed me to sing the closing song, which was our cover of the Barry Mann, Cynthia Weil song, "We Gotta Get Out of This Place," as probably the Animals version of that song.
Uh-huh.
So we did a very animalistic version of that song. I mean, it really was, three chords and an attitude version. And this was the first time I'd sang on stage in public since fourth grade production of Wizard of Oz. I kind of knew, knowing David, it was going to be the last time I was going to sing on stage. So I gave it my all. I mean, I just screamed and screamed and screamed. I mean, Arthur Janov and his primal scream had nothing on me that night. And at CB's, there are footlights like this, and there are lights like this. So you don't really see your audience, other than a sense of room tone. You don't really know if you're playing to 5 people, 50 people, 100 people. You don't know. So, we sort of knew because of the, the amount of applause told us that the gig was gently attended. But at the end, I just screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed. The lights on the stage went down. The house lights came up. And there was my mother and 4 of her friends from Forest Hills, Queens. And she was screaming at me, and she was saying, "It was in the Village Voice. If it's in the Village Voice, anyone can come. If anyone can come, I can come." And I wanted to die. I just wanted to die.
Well, how was her review?
Basically, she was saying to me what she always said to me, which is, the life you're living doesn't make sense. Why don't you move home?
Sure.
That was her review.
So how long did this band last?
So we lasted, I think, from early 1978, if I recall, through the Zoo Manifestival. And we broke up shortly thereafter due to some non-creative tensions between some of the band members. I tried to, as a child of divorced parents, I of course tried to make everything nice. I was not able to be successful. So there I was now, somebody with that stamp in my passport, can play guitar in a band. And a whole bunch of friends in the community. And one of them, I think it was Dion King, said, "Hey, Rees Chatham just left our band. We need a guitar player. Are you free?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am actually." So I joined Arsenal, which had existed before me and existed after me, I think.
Right.
And we played places like The Kitchen and Tier 3, otherwise known as TR3, and a bunch of Lower Manhattan, East Village, what is now Tribeca, but was then God knows what, sort of loft venues.
Yeah.
And it was great. I didn't sing with Arsenal, but nor did I want to, because we had a singer who could scream better than I could, and that was a guy named Charlie Nash.
Right.
And David was a sort of stand-up drummer. Dion played bass. We all had the same level of musicianship, which is to say, not so much, but it worked. It felt organic and like we were all complementing each other, even as we were going in the same direction, in a way that Made in USA never quite gelled.
Sure.
And it was, ecstatic for me. I felt like I was doing what I was meant to do, which was playing loud, noisy guitar through a Fender Twin in small rooms in front of an audience of people who 2 nights later would be doing the same thing themselves.
Sure. So it's interesting that both of these bands, Made in USA and Arsenal, they both played at Gomelsky's Zoo Festival in October.
That's correct.
In October of '78. But it seems like Made in USA was happening right at this really fascinating time for music in New York City, beginning in '78 and continuing through '78, when around the spring of '78, Brian Eno comes to town because he's caught wind of this yet to be named no wave scene.
There was music in the cafes at night and revolution in the air.
Sure. So, and Gomelsky also comes to New York sometime around the spring of '78, looking to put together interesting musicians doing interesting work to pair up with the European avant-garde that he's been working with. So in this time in '78, do you come across Brian Eno? Obviously you do come across Gomelsky, but did you ever run into Eno?
Yeah, and I'm going to go backwards a bit, which is that Made in USA, I think our first rehearsal was in one of these by-the-hour rehearsal spaces that were popping up all over at the time to accommodate the need. There was more demand than there was supply. And then David, or I think his then girlfriend, Ann Rupel, somehow hooked up with Giorgio and Bill Laswell, who was Giorgio's sort of studio factotum, and said, "Why don't you come rehearse here if Giorgio likes you?" And the deal was, it was never explicitly said, but we all understood it to be, if Giorgio likes you, you can rehearse here for free. If Giorgio vaguely likes you, you can rehearse here for money. And if Giorgio doesn't like you, get the fuck out. But he liked what we were doing, or maybe he liked what the potential of what we could be doing. I don't know, but we rehearsed there and for free, and it was great. And as for Eno, we all knew he was in town, because I think, at that point, the kind of, looking back on it now, it looks like there were 2 separate movements, glam and punk, which were discrete historical errors, the Pleistocene, the Jurassic. And in real lived life at the time, it wasn't like that. If you were a punk, you probably did like Roxy Music, and you probably did like Bowie, So we knew who Brian Eno was, certainly. We all had the first Roxy Music album.
Right.
And, I forget at what time there was, Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, or Here Come the Warm Jets, or things like that. But Eno was certainly a figure in our larger, sort of ambit. And I would see him from time to time. I lived on 8th Street for a period between McDougal and 6th, above a shoe store. And there was a little cafe right down the block, sort of halfway between me and the 8th Street bookstore. And I would sometimes go there for coffee in the morning. And Eno would sometimes go there for coffee in the morning. It was right across the street from Electric Ladyland, the recording studios. And I would like look at him and, well, that was Eno. And then, and then
well, he was apparently recruiting also. I mean, he eventually would put together this No New York album.
Right.
And he recruited some of the bands from the scene you were playing with.
Yeah, and everybody sort of like one of the wait staff at this little cafe was Sally Ham, who was, later, very soon after joined UT, which is a band that still exists, still plays.
Ah.
But he was sort of looking around. He was kind of Eno was always looking for, what's not in some, I think, kind of cigar chomping entrepreneurial, what's the next big thing, could he be an early clue to the new direction? That wasn't Eno. He was interested in, what was bubbling up. And I think, he recorded some demos with television, long before they did their extraordinary first album. I know he was had many conversations with Terry Ork, who's a kind of forgotten figure, but it was sort of the godfather of lots of this. Ran the Cinemabilia bookshop and was the person who employed and put together employed television as booksellers and put together that band in some certain ways and managed them and put out their first single. So Eno was around and there was one night at Giorgio's loft in Chelsea, which was a sort of ground level, but there were also a couple upper stories. And it was somewhere between a gig and an open house or an open rehearsal. I mean, a few of us bands who played at Giorgio's were playing, but at night, but where people could come. I mean, it wasn't really a gig, but it wasn't really not a gig, and it wasn't really a rehearsal, and it wasn't really not a rehearsal. It was a kind of
Giorgio fostered a party atmosphere, it seems.
Oh my God, yes. And I think Giorgio was never happier than when the band stopped playing and the party ended, and he could go upstairs with some interesting people and do whatever he did. We were there getting ready to play, and there was Eno. And I don't know how he had heard about it. I'm pretty sure this was not a gig for which we put out flyers or, the traditional method of, wheat paste on the little trapezoid at the bottom of street lamps, all of that kind of stuff. And, Giorgio yelled at him and told him to get out.
What?
Yeah, he screamed at him.
Just on
this
the
is
spot.
not verbatim, but it was like, Eno, you're dead. You have cold in your heart. You have no soul. Get out. I mean, he was basically, and very politely complied. And we were, I think, it was a sort of 1-2 punch for us, because on the one hand, oh my God, Eno's here. Maybe he'll discover us. Maybe he'll record us. And then, but we were also nervouser than shit. How the fuck do you play before Brian Eno?
Right.
And so it solved that problem. I guess it solved both problems,
Yeah. This is the first I've heard of Eno and Gomelsky actually having any kind of words, and it sounds like Eno didn't get many words in, if any.
No, and also Giorgio was a voluble type, and Eno was a very quiet type. I mean, I would love to see a kind of mismatched buddy cop movie with the two of them. That would be fun.
Yeah.
Giorgio behind the wheel of a brown Ford Crown Vic and Eno in the passenger seat looking at the world passing by.
It was, in the research that I've done on this, it always seemed odd to me that they didn't meet more or, have more conversations, because they were working with a lot of the same people, but they were going kind of in different directions, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think certain elements of the European avant-garde, the sort of Henry Cow of it all, appealed to Giorgio. Did have some, I think they were both interested in things like Can. There was, I think, some overlap there,
Sure.
And if the albums that Eno and Bowie and Tony Visconti later recorded in Hansaton Studio, not later actually, Low and Heroes, and Iggy's The Idiot, and are very, very drenched in a certain European avant-garde.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think there was some overlap in their areas of interest, but their sensibilities were so different.
Sure. Well, later on in 79 or so, Bill Laswell would start working with Eno, and of course, Laswell had been working with Giorgio and for all of 1978 and part of 1979. Then Laswell goes to work with Eno, and they end up doing the On Land album in a studio that Eno was kind of helping Laswell and Martin Beasy put together at the time. That was what became the Material Band and the Material production crew.
Even at the time that we were all these sort of wastrels with instruments rehearsing at Giorgio, in essence, the house band was Bill, who, in addition to sort of being the factotum of the place, was also, as we all know, a composer and musician of the first water. Right. And there was also, Cliff Coultrey, I think. Coultrey, yeah, that's it. And Michael Beinhorn.
Michael Beinhorn, yes.
Yeah. And they were sort of the core of the kind of house band there. And they were, they were very, very...
And Fred Marr on drums.
Fred Marr. Oh, of course. Fred, who was just, the nicest guy you will ever meet. And they were kind of the house band. And as opposed to us, as opposed to many, many, many of the people who rehearsed there, they were really good. They were real musicians. Sort of, if what they were doing was music, what we were doing was chopped liver. But they kind of anchored the place and gave it a sensibility. And I don't know how much of that was Giorgio and how much of that was Bill Laswell, where that sort of, Bill, I got the sense, was kind of into Ornette Coleman, certain kinds of free jazz. He didn't come out of punk. He came out of a kind of, I would say, a kind of the grand chain of the improvisatory tradition.
Sure. Right. Yeah. And of course, Gomelsky had a vision. This building that you were rehearsing in, that was his home also, he called it the Zoo House. And of course, this festival that he's putting together for October of 78 is called the Zoo Manna Festival. And he released the first Material album not long after that with Laswell on his record label, which was called Zoo Records. So clearly Gomelsky had a plan centered around this zoo company that he was putting together. And part of that plan involved getting... He befriended Bill Laswell, liked his playing. They shared, the way they met was their shared love for Magma, which the band
that makes complete sense.
In France, the band that Giorgio had been managing in France. That's how they bond. That's how Laswell and Gomelsky bond initially. And then Gomelsky basically funds Laswell, Laswell to some degree, and encourages him to assemble a band, which Laswell does. And that's all those players that you mentioned that Laswell basically advertised for in the record stores of Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great unanswered questions, and I don't demand an answer for it, is sort of, where did the money come from?
Right.
Giorgio got it from somewhere, maybe from the royalties of Yardbird stuff or whatnot, or from the bands he managed, or from various entrepreneurial things. But I got the sense that he owned that place rather than rented it. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, he didn't actually own the building, but he lived there for over, basically from 78 until the end of his life.
Yeah.
It was his relationship with, I believe was the owners of Charlie Records. I think they actually owned the property and kind of gave it to Giorgio for whatever past work and collaborations that they had done together, which also included some Yardbirds material that was released by Charlie Records. So yeah, there was definitely a relationship there, and trying to untangle any of that business mess, good luck.
Yeah, exactly. But I think a lot of sort of for instance, it was the same time that the art world as we know it now was being aborting in Lower Manhattan and a few adjacent places. So like there was a bar called Puffy's. If you didn't have the money to pay your bar bill, he would accept a work of art, figuring if one of those 20 people hit it, he would be okay. And in fact, yes. I mean, so I think money was sort of appearing from odd places where money had not appeared from before.
Right.
So that may have been, if you had one painting, God knows, what is a Basquiat worth now?
Right. Yeah.
At the time he was, a wonderful emerging graffiti artist.
Right. Yeah. So Giorgio has this plan for this festival.
Yeah.
And he has Bill putting together this band. And Giorgio's idea is that this band, of course, it's called the Zoo Band initially, before it gets renamed Material later, will be the backing band for David Allen, who Giorgio had also worked with in France with the band Gong. David Allen
this is Daevid.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And David Allen was also one of the founding members of the original Soft Machine.
Yes.
So Giorgio had a very close relationship with David Allen, and he wants to bring David Allen to New York as the headliner for the festival. Did you ever meet David Allen?
Either glancingly or not at all. I mean, I certainly knew who he was. I know the music, not extensively, but no, I wish I had.
So you're in this band Made in USA. You're rehearsing at Giorgio's place. You must catch wind of this festival that he's putting together somehow. And do you remember how you get involved with it?
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a lot of talk of it around the rehearsal space, and I think David and Ann, I think, were kind of friendly at the time with Fred Frith.
Uh-huh.
And, he was certainly part of this.
He was, but he was kind of a late addition, it seems.
Well, I would trust your chronology better than my own here.
Right. Yeah, because Giorgio definitely brings Fred Frith over from England, but Fred's name is not on any of the promotional material, which makes me think
maybe he was a late arrival. But
right.
But I don't recall some definitive moment where it was like, pretty please, can we be on the bill? Oh yeah, you can play. It just seemed kind of like, we were playing in, of course, since we were part of Giorgio's stable, we were part of, this day-long, night-long thing.
Right.
It didn't feel like some grand transition or like one of those moments in an old Warner Brothers musical, the Starbroker, Leg and Flow Ziegfelds in the audience. Can you go on? It wasn't
Right.
that.
Well, unlike Fred Frith, your band, Made in USA, did get on the promotional material. And I thought maybe I could show you the poster that was used for the festival right now, and we could maybe have you comment not only on your
Sure.
own band, but maybe on some of the other bands that you recognize on the poster.
Sure.
How about if
I
pull
actually
that up?
know this poster, and you can share screen with it.
All right.
So I see David Allen.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of myself for having gotten the spelling right on that.
Yes.
Chris Cutler, I do remember. Yeah.
Yeah, he and Fred were in Henry Cow, which had broken up at that
Yes.
point.
Yes, exactly. I remember, and a lot of this I don't remember because, it was,
Yeah,
a
it's a
couple of
long
years
time
ago now. I remember Anton Fire, or Fear, who's a
Yeah.
really, really good drummer.
Yes, excellent drummer.
And I believe, don't know if I'm reading the poster right or remembering it right, but that X, he was in that.
Okay.
And there's Bill and Fred and Cliff Coltrari, which was, I guess,
remember,
sort of.
before that, there's Gerald Lindahl from Pass. Pass
Yeah, I have no memory of him at all.
That was an early synthesizer studio that people could use, apparently.
Oh yeah, public access synthesizer studio.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember Pass. I knew people who would hang out there. So, I don't know what Zoo may have been what we now think of as material,
Yes.
With Michael, maybe minus George Bishop. I don't know what New York Gong is.
That would be Zoo with David Allen.
Okay, that makes complete sense. I don't remember Takaiki. I don't remember Floating Garbage. I do remember Made in USA. Theoretical Girls was one of my favorite of the kind of no wave groups, and it was Glenn Branca, later of various symphonies, Jeff Lone, Walt Wharton Tears, Margaret Dewis, and actually Arsenal, my next band, played a gig with Theoretical Girls at the Kitchen that I recall very, very clearly.
Yeah, and at this point, Arsenal had Rees Chatham in it.
Yeah, Rees Chatham was the guitarist of Arsenal, and Rees left to do various solo things, and that created the space for me to join Arsenal. I'm
Right.
looking over this list of names. I don't know what Yurok magazine is.
Yeah, because the festival included journalists, and there was a panel discussion that was part of the festival. It was kind of a mixture of journalists and musicians and presenters.
Yes, okay, I actually remember that. And I remember actually some of the poetry, particularly Jane Bliss Nodland, who was a poet I was familiar with. So I think, as it's coming back to me now, it wasn't just, as in, some music festival in a muddy field, like, 14 straight hours of music. There was that panel of discussion. There were poetry segments. There were things like that,
Sure.
And it was not done at a breakneck pace. I mean, it wasn't like one band got off and the other band already had its stuff set up. It was a little, more DIY than that.
So maybe if you can recall any of the details, maybe try to describe to us what Festival Day was like for you and your band.
There was, I think, a certain amount of chaos involved. George, if you're looking for the guy who will make the trains run on time, that's not Giorgio. I mean, it's just not who he is. It's not his MO. And he sort of delegated that stuff to Bill Laswell, who was his factotum, but sometimes his sort of hitman.
Yeah, and Bill had I know he was getting help from Martin Beasy as a stagehand,
Yeah.
and Paul Sears, was the drummer in the band The Muffins.
Oh, okay.
He also ended up kind of last minute being the live sound guy for the entire festival.
Yeah, and I think if I recall correctly, and again, I may not, I don't recall there being a sort of tight run of show, the way that we do it now, where it's like, 4:45, this band goes on,
Right.
Um, we kind of knew where in the day we were, but we were going to hang out there anyway as audience, if not performers.
Sure.
So we just hung out until somebody said, like, after the band, after this band, you're on. And I don't remember who said that. My guess it was Laswell, because I can't imagine who else would have done that. And we took the stage, we did our set, we didn't change the world, and then we hung out. There was a kind of green room, makes it sound too elegant. There was an area that was not quite backstage and not quite audience. It was sort of a little, Intermedia Theater was, I believe, the old Anderson Theater, and was, goes all the way back to the heyday of the Yiddish theater in New York back in, the sort of, 20s and 30s. So, it was not modern facility, and there was a house PA system, but it wasn't great. And I don't remember who was on the boards for that. Was that Martin Beasy, maybe?
It would have been Paul Sears, probably.
Of course, yeah. But I think there were a lot of familiar faces whom we knew either from the scene or whom we knew from fellow rehearsal people at Giorgio's. But a lot of new faces, a lot of hello, who are you? Oh, cool. I think there was a kind of hothouse community created, which is to say, for 12, or I guess now you're telling me 14 hours, we were all comrades.
Right.
And then we sort of scattered our separate ways.
Right. I have some photos also. That's Mr. Laswell.
It is. I mean, my memory of Bill is pretty much as that. I remember that hat very well. My memory of him is having a kind of hipster nickel spot, but that may have gone on and off. But yeah, that's Bill, absolutely. And, many of the rest of us were dressed sort of more punkishly, and he was dressed, I think, more kind of, but that was Bill, absolutely. With that kind of sort of kind of beret and a kind of, attitude and a bass.
So here's
man, that looks like the sort of recording of We Are the World or something.
Yeah,
look at all
it's
those
a bit
people
of
on stage.
So speculation here is that this is a composite image, which makes sense because it's in this panoramic form. But in the center there is David Allen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
right there
to the
and
left,
there's Bill being Bill.
Yeah, there's Bill, and to the left of David Allen are children that played the role of the Pothead Pixies in David Allen's song mythologies that he was presenting.
But as you can see from the hairstyles, there's a sort of mixture of sort of hangover hippie and, punk stuff.
Right.
So Dr. Space, Giorgio Gomelsky, there's Giorgio. It's funny, I always thought of Giorgio as so much older, and I'm looking at him, and he wasn't that old at the time.
Yeah, I think he's probably maybe is around 40 or early 40s.
Yeah, which at that point was impossibly old. But yeah.
Yeah. Now here's a picture of the panel discussion.
Okay,
Uh,
there's Robert Christgau, misspelled there, Dean of American Rock and Roll Critics, and as he would tell you. Um, okay, Chris Cutler, Chris Coltreri, don't know John Page, don't know Michael Bloom. There's David Allen, absolutely.
yeah, so
Um,
I scraped this photo and this information off of Facebook, and apparently the information is a little bit off because as Rees Chatham pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago, that's him
that
second
is Rees. That is
second
Rees
from the right.
to basically David Allen's right, our left. Yes.
Yeah.
The ones that I recognize the most are Chris Gow and Rees, who were people they were not close friends, but they're, I knew, I knew those guys.
Oh, lovely.
So that's Hilly, that's me, that's Hassan, that's David, that's Ali. But, we were pleased and honored and very happy to be, we were young. We didn't know what the fuck we were doing. We were not real musicians. I mean, we all kind of sort of played an instrument. What we had was, and we were not trying to forge careers. What we had was, again, there was music in the cafes at night and revolution in the air, and we were trying to do that.
Right.
And looking back at it, I'm very, very proud of myself for, I'm somebody who's happiest with a blanket over my head and reading a book with a flashlight.
Right.
And one of the things that it did for me was my writing up to that point had been very, very precious. I mean, each word meant a lot to me. Sometimes so much so that it was paralytic. And once you've played really, really bad notes in real time in front of an audience of 50, 100 more people, it's very hard to be quite that precious anymore.
Sure.
And I think it freed up my writing a lot. And just to tell you the second half of the story, so I went from the sort of lower Manhattan art, music, revolution, I am nothing and must be everything. Underneath the paving stones is the beach place. By sort of incremental steps to where I am now, which is, somebody who's made a living as a screenwriter for several decades now, has had, 1, 2, 3 produced films with, my name as sole credit on it, contributed to any number of other things, written any huge numbers of things that haven't gotten made. I just finished 6 weeks of work on an HBO TV series, which will premiere in the fall. I'm a professor at USC. I'm a former president of the Writers Guild. I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. I'm an artistic director of the Sundance Screenwriting Labs. Lots of cultural bureaucrat stuff. I'm on the National Film Preservation Board, the Franco-American Cultural Fund. I could go on.
Sure.
I see this face and I see the same four-eyed bohemian you saw when I shared the screen.
Right.
Other people look at this face and they say, he would be really good in long, boring meetings. And I've never figured out, there's a contradiction in my life somewhere that I don't understand, that other people clearly understand better than I do.
Right.
But here I am, and I see interesting continuities between the person I was then and the person I am now. Well, clearly, I mean, in some kind of biological sense, I'm the same person. But the kind of spirit of that moment in time and the sense of community forged by the passage of a few people through that moment of time,
sure,
is what animates my life and work today. So, it feels the same, except, I'm not thrashing my guitar going 1, 2, 3, 4, wham anymore.
And I think a lot of us that experienced the punk movement and the post-punk movement have a similar story, that this is what we learned from it. We learned a sense of freedom of expression, that and a loss of fear of maybe trying the unknown.
Absolutely. I think for those of us, there are some people who are just born extroverted assholes and they didn't need to conquer their fear. In fact, they should have more of it. But for those of us who have sort of hard shells and mostly lived within ourselves, it was a moment where you could actually engage in public performance and public interaction without having to stop being who you were.
Right.
And I think that's a life lesson that has carried with me all the time. So
Right.
that, to the extent that I now get hired because of who I am rather than in spite of it, that's due to the self that was forged in those days.
Great. Well, Howard, thank you very much for sharing your stories with us.
Happy to.
I wanted to also let people know that the Zoo Festival performances were recorded, including the Made in USA performances at the festival, and people can hear those recordings on the Giorgio Gomelsky tribute website, and I'll put up a link to that if you're interested in listening to that. So Howard, thank you very much.
I can't thank you enough for, first of all, for many things. One is for your interest in something which, to go back to obscure Godard films, in Masculine and Feminine, there's an intertitle that says "Human Labor Resurrects Things from the Dead," and that's what you're doing. You're taking this piece of history that could have just been, hidden by the sands of time, and you're making it vivid and you're making it live. And in some academic sense, you're historicizing it, but in some other sense, you're saying the past isn't dead. In fact, it's not even the past. And in this case, that's a very good thing. And I can't thank you enough for the spirit of that and for all the hard work behind it.
Well, thanks a lot, Howard. And I think it's an important moment in music history, and more people need to know about it. And thanks to your stories, they will.
One more. This is our cover version. This was #1 in Armed Forces Radio in 1967 in Vietnam. It was written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. We do it with additional lyrics by Karl Marx.